All right, let's jump straight into this. We are looking at a really fascinating explainer today, where we take a single, seemingly ordinary legal case, but examine it through four entirely different academic lenses. We are unpacking the defense of Dr. Chen Yuan, an independent scholar. So instead of just looking at standard legal arguments, the source materials we're exploring today apply a truly multidisciplinary prism. We're going to see exactly how theories from physics, formal logic, cognitive psychology, and even artificial intelligence all intersect to evaluate a single judicial event.
Here's the roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll cover the retweet and the charge. Second, the physics of information spread. Third, analyzing legal, logical fallacies. Fourth, the cognitive psychology divide. And fifth, how AI evaluates the case.
Starting with Section 1, the retweet and charge, the incident at the core.
So the whole thing kicks off with the prosecution charging Dr. Chen Yuan with picking quarrels and provoking trouble. The core of their argument is that forwarding online posts on a social media platform caused severe public order chaos. But, the defense hits back with a really fundamental question. Can a single retweet, literally just forwarding non-original content, actually cause real-world systemic chaos? To figure that out, we have to look at the actual data.
Let's put the scale of this into perspective. According to the source documents, the defendant's account had fewer than 100 followers, and honestly, many of those were just inactive or bot accounts. Over nearly 3 years, he had under 100 total retweets and virtually zero engagement. So we're talking about an account with practically zero social influence, being accused of causing a severe systemic disruption.
Moving right along to Section 2, Physics of Information Spread, applying complex systems science.
Okay, this is where the defense gets incredibly interesting. They actually bring in quantum-adjacent network physics to mathematically argue that Dr. Chen didn't just not cause chaos, he physically couldn't do it. They argue that social networks operate under this concept from physics called self-organized criticality. Think of it like a massive, unstable snowpack on a mountain, right? The system naturally evolves to this critical state. Once it's there, sure, a small trigger can cause a massive avalanche, but that trigger still needs enough energy to set off the chain reaction.
So let's break down the math. Using what's known as the Galton-Watson branching process, the defense mathematically models how these retweets cascade. Every post has a branching factor, called M, which represents how many further shares it generates. Because he had fewer than 100 followers, Dr. Chen's M is roughly 0.05. Put simply, for every 100 people who see it, only 5 might share it. Anytime your M is less than 1, the cascade extinction probability is exactly 100%. The spark literally dies instantly. Triggering an avalanche of public chaos from this specific account is, statistically speaking, an impossible event. Plus, the internet is just inherently messy. According to the CAP theorem, distributed networks are always disorderly. You can't perfectly synchronize them. And because social networks rely on massive hubs, think your mega influencers or celebrities, an isolated edge node, like Dr. Chen's account, is practically invisible to the overall system. To put it another way, you can't break the entire internet by unplugging a single isolated router in your living room. The defense points out that any systemic chaos is just an intrinsic property of the network itself, not the result of one subcritical retweet.
Which brings us to Section 3, analyzing legal logical fallacies. Formal logic meets the law.
When you evaluate the judicial documents themselves, the sources note that the specific charge applied here is what's called a result offense. That means the prosecution absolutely must prove actual empirical harm. They need hard, quantifiable data showing that social order was severely disrupted. But the defense points out that this empirical evidence is entirely absent from the case files. They just state the conclusion of severe chaos without the actual factual proof to back it up.
And there's also a massive, and I mean massive, category mistake in the judicial documents drawing right from language philosophy. Look, the law penalizes the spread of false information, which naturally requires a falsifiable fact, basically a statement that you can objectively prove to be true or false. But the posts in question here were cartoons, subjective emotional expressions, and academic theories. You can't put a true or false value on those. Categorizing art and theory as objective false information is just a fundamental error in formal logic.
The defense also catches this truly stunning leap of logic in the judgment. The prosecution actually stated that because the defendant had a high educational level, he should distinguish right from wrong and therefore had subjective intent to cause harm. From a logic standpoint, that is a textbook ad hominem, a guilt by status fallacy. Just being highly educated doesn't automatically prove malicious intent, right? An academic might simply save or share controversial stuff purely for research.
Shifting gears a bit, Section 4, the cognitive psychology divide. System 1 versus System 2.
Looking at the human element here, the source texts identify a really stark contrast in cognitive processing styles. The institution leans heavily on what psychologist Daniel Kahneman calls System 1 processing. That's your fast, rigid, and emotional thinking. They're showing heavy confirmation bias, essentially only looking for evidence that fits their initial anchor of picking quarrels. On the flip side, the defendant is using System 2 processing, slow, analytical reasoning. He's using cognitive complexity to build these multidisciplinary, scientific defenses instead of just lashing out emotionally.
Psychologically speaking, what Dr. Chen did here is a textbook example of cognitive resilience and post-traumatic growth. Instead of falling into learned helplessness under all that stress and isolation, he pivoted to meaning-making. He took his academic background and transformed profound environmental stress into highly structured, objective, historical, and scientific documentation. It's really impressive.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, AI evaluates the case, the machine perspective. This part is so cool. The source materials actually fed the exact same legal and scientific data into 6 different large language models, and each AI came back with a totally unique angle. Gemini tore apart the legal logic, ChatGPT did a structural analysis of the procedural errors, Grok zoomed way out to look at macro civilization and human rights, DeepSeek checked for tech policy misalignments, and QN essentially played the role of a defense attorney offering actionable legal strategies. They all had totally different parameters. But here is the absolute kicker. Despite all having completely different analytical focuses and programming weights, every single model reached a 100% consensus on 4 critical flaws. Unanimously, they agreed there was 0 evidence of objective harm. They completely rejected that guilt by status logical fallacy. They flagged severe procedural flaws, and every single one raised significant concerns about constitutional rights to free expression.
The big takeaway for us here is that this AI meta-analysis acts as a completely impartial, mathematical audit. It's not driven by emotion, it's not driven by political bias, it is purely a structural analysis of facts weighed against defined legal parameters. And this machine-driven audit overwhelmingly backs up the defendant's scientific, logical, and psychological arguments, really shining a light on systemic errors in the human judicial process.
So I want to leave you with this thought. When multidisciplinary science, from the physics of networks to the mechanics of human cognition, all backed up by unanimous artificial intelligence, universally points out a structural anomaly and a total failure in logic, what is the next step for our human institutions? How do systems designed to uphold order react when science mathematically proves they are acting disorderly? It's a fascinating intersection of law and science, and I really hope this explainer gave you a whole new perspective on the depth of this specific case. Thanks for sticking with me on this deep dive.